So good morning, everyone. Thank you all for joining us. I want to thank Brian Lefsky always for making all of our connectivity possible. I want to thank Amy always for making all of our connectivity possible. This is actually, Yehuda Kurtzer is our 20th Hartman speaker during the pandemic. And all of that is only because of Amy's tireless efforts. So thank you, Hartman, and thank you, Amy. Want to thank Yehuda Kurtzer, who is, as you know, the president of Shalom Hartman North America. Want to thank Talia Graff, his colleague, who is the director of programming at Hartman, for both being here this morning. So I just want to frame it this way. This is a really interesting time to be alive and a really interesting time to be invested in the Jewish community. And I feel like this talk that Yehuda is going to give and the dialogue he's going to initiate is just very Talmudic in the following way. When the Babylonian army destroyed the first temple, the rabbis didn't say, oh, that happened because the Babylonian army was so much stronger than the Jewish army. They said, no, there's some moral issues here. There's idolatry, adultery, bloodshed. We got to get our moral act together. When the second temple was destroyed by Rome in the year 70, the rabbis didn't say, oh yeah, that happened because the Roman army was so much stronger. They said, no, there's a moral issue here. We got to think about, sinat chinam, groundless hatred. How do we relate to one another? And when this pandemic happened and did what it did and turned us online, and from which we are now emerging, an authentic Jewish move is to reflect and say, wow, what did this whole event, this whole online, this whole virus, this whole lockdown, this whole pandemic, what did it reveal to us about us? And a measure of reflection and self-reflection is just the most distinctive Jewish impulse. And so we couldn't have anybody better than Yehuda to lead us through that. He does this amazing podcast regularly with his colleagues from Hartman and different thought leaders. And in one recently, I think it was number 47 or number 48, he points out that a year ago, last March, there was a lot of catastrophic thinking that the Jewish community is never going to be the same and that a lot of institutions will not make it, etc. And in the course of episode 47 and episode 48 of his podcast, he reflects broadly on the fact that all of the meltdown, apocalyptic thinking, fortunately, did not happen. And that many Jewish institutions are not only okay, they're actually even stronger than they were before the pandemic. So we are just so grateful to Yehuda as we are emerging from this lockdown. Our morning minion this morning had a conversation with Michelle Robinson and Dr. Howard Heller about actually being back in person inside the Rabbi Chill Sanctuary. Next Sunday, we are emerging from the pandemic. We're going to be back in person praying together inside the building for the first time in a year and a month. We couldn't think of a better person to lead us through this conversation than our friend, our rabbi, and our teacher, Yehuda Kurtzer. Yehuda, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Rabbi. Thank you, Amy and Brian, and all of you. It's great to see you, even in this continually weird experience of seeing people who I am used to being together in person with through the Zoom. But I think all of us have just gotten better at all of this, at our attention span online, our availability, our receptivity, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later on. What we went in search of during this pandemic as something that might actually help us understand what we need. Noticing how deeply so many people have, I've seen this through the Hartman Institute programs, so many people have been seeking community, wisdom, spirituality during this time, tells us a really powerful story about who we are, what we need, that we want to be able to take advantage of it in the future. And I'll say this, it won't be this summer, but next year in Jerusalem. So I'm hoping that we'll have an opportunity to learn together again in person sooner rather than later. So Wes, I appreciate the opening and the frame because it's exactly what I want to try to talk about today. The ways in which we are a Jewish community and a set of individuals living in history and at a particular time period. The extent to which what we have been experiencing as a Jewish community is of enormous theological and political significance, and the beginnings, the kernels of an awareness that the processes that have emerged during this time about what our community is about, what's going to endure, are of historical significance. There's a weird thing that we as the Jewish people, we know that our ability to walk through history has been shaped by not only what has happened to us, but we have done in response to those historical events. We are not, as the Jewish people, victims of history. We are actually incredibly creative respondents to history. And yet it's interesting, it's very frequently the case that people will say, well, it's too soon to tell what the impact of this historical event was on us. This was, by the way, a bias around post-Holocaust theology, where people said for a while, it's too soon to actually formulate a post-Holocaust theology. And meanwhile, you turn your head and even 10 years, 5 years, 1 year after the Shoah, it's already being written. So I think part of our work today, and really for the next few months and few years, is to not merely look around and say, how did the pandemic change us, but to actually be invested in writing the story of how the pandemic changed us and how it should change us, to take stock not only of the historical events that overtook us, but the things that we implicitly learned that we want to turn into programmatic lessons. Today is not going to be the theological lessons of the pandemic, although I think that there are many and they're quite significant. The experience, even the global theological meaning of as far as we are apart from one another in the world, one tiny virus's capacity to actually immobilize an entire world is extraordinary and teaches us a lot about global connectivity more than we think. There's a huge lesson there about the ways that all of us are identically created in the image of God and therefore vulnerable to the same type of conditions. There's a lot of theology that's possible to emerge of this moment. But today, I want to talk more about the structural lessons of pandemic for Jewish community and for its institutions. And one day, all of those conversations, the economic consequences, the psychological consequences, theological, all of these will become all pieces of the kind of Torah that we learn from this pandemic about ourselves and as our future. I also want to say, Wes, you made reference to the discussion on the podcast where it's true. In March of 2020, I wrote a semi-apocalyptic essay on what was going to break during this time, and more recently in this podcast, I said, well, it didn't exactly happen as planned. Now, this is partly why I don't like to be in the prognostication business, because it's so easily disprovable, especially in short windows of time. The easiest way to kind of justify making a bad prediction is to say, well, it didn't happen yet, right? To turn your predictions into something not falsifiable. And I think it is reasonable to say that there are going to be communal consequences for this pandemic that may not have exactly hit yet, but will over the next few years. But I would rather take the lesson about epistemological humility and say, I may have been wrong about some of these predictions. And so I think my Torah will be more useful retrospectively than it is prospectively. More, what did we learn and what can we take from this? And less, what can we expect will happen in our communities? The last thing, just as an opening, is this is not theoretical for me or for you. You are a synagogue community, and you are more than that. You represent the leadership of a major institution in your community. And so the questions we're going to discuss today around Jewish communal life are not theoretical. I know that they're very much applied, and I hope that surfaces when we get to the Q&A. How does the Torah that we learned from this experience actually translate into a real sense of planning for our future that is irrevocably changed on the basis of our past? Many of you probably heard me speak pre-pandemic. I know I spoke about it one summer at Hartman in Jerusalem, that prior to the pandemic, we were already living in a period of enormous disruption in American Jewish communal life. I talked frequently about the ways in which American Jewish life had been undergoing a series of revolutions that we as the Jewish community miscategorized as evolutions. revolutions that we were thinking too much of as evolutions. There's a natural reason we do this. We are less scared by evolutions than we are by revolutions. Revolutions tend to be dramatic and violent. They tend to force us to really think differently about our world, whereas evolutions, we can live with that. That's like what's called some version of Jewish continuity. The past is recognizable in the present. But I've talked for 10 years now about three major revolutions that have been underway in Jewish society in North America around, usefully alliterated for you, around identity, ideology, and infrastructure. Identity is who are Jews, where once upon a time, Jews in America knew Jews in America and non-Jews in America knew the difference and policed the difference between a Jew and a non-Jew, and that distinction has become morally and communally irrelevant for most American Jews. In the realm of ideology, that once upon a time for Jews in America, there were a certain set of ideas and commitments that constituted a common Judaism. But now we as a Jewish community disagree about a lot more and a lot more deeply than we hold in common. And third, and perhaps most relevant for today, around infrastructure, that in the second half of the 20th century, the Jewish community created a massive communal infrastructure, billions of dollars of institutions and real estate that were elegantly designed to help the Jewish community of the mid to late 20th century to confront its challenges. And as many of us are aware, in the last 10, 20 years, we have been waking up to realize that the needs of the Jewish community and the infrastructure of the Jewish community oftentimes just do not line up with one another. And the inherent problem baked into that, which is an infrastructure will do everything it needs to do to preserve itself. And that's not the same as asking what infrastructure needs to be created or dismantled to help a Jewish community through its challenges. I think it's reasonable to say, even though as I said at the beginning, I'm not sure that the community fell apart during this time. In fact, we noticed all the ways that it didn't. That the pandemic, for the most part, has been an accelerant of trends in Jewish life. If all of us were required to suspend how we do what we do as Jewish community institutions, right? Not suspend what we do, but suspend how we do what we do. I've been at Temple Emmanuel services, and they're great. Right? It's a really deep, powerful, good show. And you all were expected immediately to stop doing what you do, how you do it. That creates unbelievable test conditions. The uncertainty, if you were good at what you were doing, this time period has forced the question of, will we be able to go back to how it was before? If you weren't that good at what you were doing beforehand, the question is, will we ever be able to amount the momentum to actually hold our institutions together going forward? So all of these trends around identity, ideology, and infrastructure are receiving a kind of accelerant in almost laboratory conditions that are creating the uncertainty going forward. In some cases, some institutions and communities, the activity of saying we no longer can do what we do, how we do it, was a huge boon to what they did. Turns out, I think this is probably true for Temple Emmanuel also, you're probably better online than you thought you might be. There are hiccups here and there, things that didn't go exactly as planned, but it was probably better. There were people who you probably reached during this time who you weren't reaching before. Right, but the whole activity of we can't do what we do, how we do it, is in some ways a mirror, or I would say a magnifying glass on this set of existential challenges that we faced in the Jewish community beforehand. Now, there are two sets of questions that we can talk about. Some are macroeconomic, what happens to our collective infrastructure as a Jewish community, but I think it'll be equally important, if not more, in this context to talk more microeconomically, what happens to a particular community, a synagogue, a Jewish community center, a hillel, where it's not just, sometimes exceptional institutions are able to withstand or buck the trends nationally. I've used this example many times before. In the conservative movement, 40% of conservative synagogues have shut over the past 40 years. So that's a huge macroeconomic trend, but it may not be relevant to whether a single individual conservative synagogue can actually thrive during the same period of time. So sometimes we have to notice that the macroeconomic trends are not actually that useful in helping to understand the microeconomic, except to the extent that they offer a contrast. What might we do differently than the field that we're in? And of course, we have to ask evolutionary questions as well. How are we forever changed? In order to do this, what I thought I would do today is study this with a kind of first principles exercise, looking at a couple of sources from our sages, the Mishnaic and Talmudic sources, about the ideal of community. What do the rabbis have to say about the construction of community, and to try to weave their thinking around community into the lessons that we take into the present. I want to do this partly because, like, it's what Jews do. You don't just talk about the present, you weave the past in. It helps you feel stronger about the present when you feel like you're traveling together with fellow travelers from our past. But also because I think, as Wes, you said at the beginning, rabbinic thinking on community is also forged in crisis. When the rabbis think about how do I construct community, they're doing so with a whole bunch of crises in their rearview mirror, the most dramatic of which, right, the great tragedy at the heart of Talmudic Judaism, the destruction of the temple, the loss of an organizing principle. But more than that, because the rabbis know, and I think this is really important, we'll come back to it, the rabbis know that community is not some sort of passive reality, something that we take for granted, but a constant, active, constructed process to build community. And I mean this in the broad sense, community, but also in the local sense, a community, Temple Emmanuel, the Hartman Institute community, my neighborhood. We walk through the world thinking that those things just exist, but we know, you certainly know it if you've ever sat on the board of a shul or on any committee, if you've been in a position of clergy, that to hold that together is a constant, active, constructive project. And by looking at the rabbis' law codes in which they are trying to stipulate the rules and regulations of community in this process, we get a window into that type of thinking. And it reminds us that when we are confronting a challenge to community, the answer is not merely obviously pulling our hair out or panicking, but looking at what are the tools that one uses to construct, refine, and define community going forward. The other thing is that rabbinic Judaism is an object of empire. The rabbis are not in charge of their own civilization. That's why I think they're incredibly useful for our own period of time. They know the challenges and limitations to community as it takes place within empire. They are making active choices to build something that is not obvious to the people living down the street. And if anything is truer, I can't think of anything truer about the American Jewish experience of constructing community than the knowledge that the alternatives exist to belonging to Jewish community. And so the rabbis are a powerful example to this. The last thing I will say as the introductory piece is that I come to you today not just as a person who is studying or thinking about these issues as though I'm not a stakeholder in it. I am not just an observer to this, but I also have been running a Jewish organization during the pandemic and trying to ask the same set of questions that every rabbi is asking in a shul, which is, how do I hold this together? Are we going to be able to withstand economic and behavioral trends that may not necessarily be in our favor? Our organization, like any shul, is made up of individuals. And those individuals are struggling, in many cases suffering throughout this time. So I'm coming at this hopefully with a sense that this is not me, dispassionate sage on the stage at the Hartman Institute talking to people who are in the trenches, but that I am with you in this, trying to figure out how do we solve for our own institutions going forward. I want to share 4 ideas from rabbinic tradition, 4 ideas from the rabbis. None of these are rocket science. I don't think the best Torah has to be something you never thought about before. Sometimes the best Torah is something you kind of knew to be true, and you get elated to discover that somebody wiser before you has thought about it as well. That's the affirmation of thinking in the present, but knowing that you're part of a tradition. And they are ideas that are deeply connected to one another. All of them are under the umbrella of a communitarian ethos. And this is one of the most countercultural ideas to being a Jew in America, is to thinking in a community with a communitarian sensibility. I am not simply the liberal individual who stands on my own. I belong to something. I have to pay the price of belonging sometimes, right? That's the cost of belonging, is membership, literally and figuratively. And there's a lot I gain from belonging to community. All of these pieces operate under that umbrella. The first idea, and this is in the sources, hopefully you have the sources. I think Brian had put them in the chat as well, if you haven't seen them yet, but it's a PDF of a number of rabbinic sources. The first idea I want to look at is that community is boundaried, and it is defined by obligations. Some of you heard me speak about this when we did some of this material throughout this year around civics in America. A lot of what this particular text has to tell us is equally useful for questions of American democracy as it might be for an American synagogue. Another way of describing the idea that community is boundaried and defined by obligation is that that community is always going to be primarily local. Was that Tip O'Neill? Yes, Boston. Wasn't that Tip O'Neill? All politics is local, right? So there is I think so, right? I think there's a Boston tie into this. Certainly, if I remember from my time in Boston, everything is local in Boston, weirdly local. The rabbis are kind of first out of the gate on this one. There's an extraordinary little text in Mishnah Bava Batra, where the rabbis say that and we don't get told who the they is, but they will become evident to us what we're talking about. They compel a partner in a courtyard to contribute to the building of a gatehouse and a door for the courtyard. So the they, pretty obviously, is the members of the condo association. Actually, on Shabbat, very weirdly, my children asked me, what is a condo? Because they were reading the real estate section of the New York Times. So I gave them a long lecture on the difference between condos and co-ops, which I felt was part of my job as a parent raising children in the New York area. And then we studied this Mishnah, because this is like a great condo text. Everybody has their own land ownership, but there are shared costs. Now, what the rabbis say here is they're not interested in telling you what the benefits are of membership. Truth is, benefits of membership is a silly game. We have to do it. You have to write, when you try to convince somebody to be a member of the shul, that there are all sorts of benefits. But the reality is that the real benefit of membership is the responsibility of belonging to something where the benefits are self-evident. So in other words, the rabbis say to us, without explanation, if you live in this town, we're going to need a gatehouse and a door for the courtyard. And you are compelled to participate in the costs of building that gatehouse. Why? Because you don't want to be vulnerable if you don't have a gatehouse, if you don't have a door, and you're ransacked by the vandals. Do I have to explain the benefits of membership to you? No, the obvious benefits of membership are security. And you can map this onto physical security. It can be emotional security. But for the rabbis, the notion of the benefits that come from membership are self-evident as the consequences of the cost of belonging. I don't have to persuade you of what you get out of this. I take for granted that you know that you gain, and that sometimes some people have to be coerced to participate in this activity. Community is boundaried and defined by obligation. It shouldn't be lost on us that this idea of communities is actually using the physical traits of community to tell us something about community as well. Our community is made up of all the people who live in the compound. Now, it's a little bit more complicated in 21st century America. You can be, presumably, a member of Temple Emmanuel who doesn't live in Newton Center, right? You can be in other parts of Newton. You can be in other parts of the Boston area. And increasingly, you can also be part of the Temple Emmanuel community, whether or not you ever lived in Newton Center. Presumably, you're finding all sorts of people who are dialing in to the Temple Emmanuel community, maybe because they had a relative there once, maybe they used to be in the shul there, or maybe they just found your services online and they liked it. But what's powerful about the Mishnah's idea of community is the sensibility that even when community feels porous, right? Even when it feels as though, wait, are we really a community if so-and-so from Tucson is now participating in our services, that there's some value to constructing community, right, around the notion that we are boundaried in some way, sometimes completely concrete, and sometimes a little bit more abstract. By the end of the Mishnah, the rabbis ask this wonderful question, Kama yehe ba'ir v'yeh kanshe ha'ir? How long does this person have to be in the town to be considered one of the people of the town? I love that phrase, one of the people of the town. How long do you have to be around before you're considered a member? And they have a time period, 12 months. I guess that's your grace period before they send you the membership application. However, kana badira, beitira, if you actually buy property, you're instantly a stakeholder. And the rabbis here again are playing with the recognition that there are things that people do that mark that they are part of a community that make them a stakeholder instantly, that they may be thinking of it themselves consciously, and it forces us to think about them as part of the story as well. The notion of community as boundaried, I think, is a critical idea for us to think forward, especially when we enter an era when people are going to participate in communal life well beyond the geography that was once thought to be necessary for Jewish life. When you go back to shul in person, there are going to be a whole bunch of people who you never are going to see in person. But that doesn't change whether or not we still think of community as in some ways boundaried. It may mean that our notion of boundaries is a little bit different than before, but the rabbis are onto something. There is something that gets created by the experience of all of us who are part of a boundaried community. And we can come back to this, there's no point of a boundaried community if we don't have obligations towards one another in that boundaried community. I'll just say as a throwaway line, there's a trend rising in synagogue life to get rid of membership dues. Maybe, I don't know, I don't actually know how Temple Emmanuel is thinking about this. There's a trend to get rid of membership dues and to say kind of either pay what you want or to build synagogues around the way Jewish organizations like my own are based, which is you don't have membership anymore, but you have philanthropy. And some are holding up the institution for others. Rabbis, I think by this text are a little ambivalent about that idea. You gain a lot, right, from the assumption that everybody has to participate in the building of the gatehouse. That's not you can't have a situation in which some are responsible for the community's security, but everybody benefits from it. That's idea number one. The second idea I want us to think with is around essential workers. This is one of the most crude pieces of pandemic vernacular that I think many of us learned, that some people are more essential than others in our communities. And part of why it was so crude is that that terminology was about whether we need them for our functioning and not whether we value them more than others. In other words, it's not like we collectively decided the person who bags your groceries when they deliver is essential to our society and therefore we're going to compensate them. But we said this person is essential to our society, therefore they can continue to work despite the fact that they actually may be more vulnerable for COVID than anyone else. Nevertheless, the one useful thing about the terminology of essential and non-essential that I found for this time was that I think a lot of us spent a lot of time during this time figuring out what was essential and non-essential about our own activities. What did we depend on in our communities and our societies, even though it was not always visible to us? What was actually more important in the running of a functional society? Turns out a strong federal government, was probably something that could have been more helpful in the early phases of the pandemic, right? It turns out that many of us have watched that the infrastructure of public health was more essential to the functioning of our society than many of us who benefit from good private insurance have been able to notice. And in Jewish communal life, I think many of us have spent a lot of time thinking about what did we actually need during this time? I noticed, for instance, with my kids, my 7-year-old really starved for social interaction for the first 4 months of the pandemic. She was really suffering. She was depressed. Zoom school really wasn't working for her. And what that meant was she was going to have to find a way to develop relationships with people who she was able to see, knowing that she couldn't really leave a 100-foot radius of our backyard. And she became friends with the neighbors' kids just because they were there. Now it's very special, right? She wound up having people, but I didn't say it to her in these terms. She's 7. She had a values clarification process, right? There was an essential exercise that she was figuring out of what she needed in her life. I wonder whether part of what we have been undertaking in this time at a synagogue level is also an essentialism exercise. What do we need and what do we not need? The rabbis give an example to this, a completely wacky little piece of Talmud in Sanhedrin 17b. The rabbis say, a Torah scholar is not permitted to reside in any city that doesn't have these 10 things. What do you need to have? Not to be a person who lives there, but a Torah scholar. If you want to be a person who's actually connected to Jewish values and Jewish ideas, you need these 10 things. And what are they? You need a functional court system, court that flogs and punishes. I would prefer that it wasn't quite so punitive, but if you're not willing to actually punish offenders, you don't have any deterrent, ostensibly. A fund collected by 2 and distributed by 3, that is, the fundraising arm and the allocations arm are on different sides of the organization. Those of you who know if the federation system will recognize this. You need to have a system to collect charity and distribute it. You need a synagogue. You need a bathhouse. Presumably the bathhouse, by the way, is also the mikvah. You need a bathroom. You need sanitation, right? You need a doctor. You need a bloodletter. I could do without the bloodletter. You need a scribe, and you need a slaughterer, and you need a teacher of young children. They said her name, Rabbi Akiva. He also adds fruit. It's a strange little piece of Talmud. We could spend more time on it. Maybe you need actually access to fresh food. So we could pick and choose from this list. I'm more intrigued by the instinct of the sages to make a list like this, to ask about their own communities. What do we need and what do we not need? It's also worth noticing what's not here. Do I need 4 shuls? Does that make, do I need that joke that we have, which is, you know, the guy in the desert island with there's 2 shuls, the one I don't go to? We make fun of for ourselves as Jews, but we don't actually need them. I'm curious to think about this as a text that could be useful for us in communities at large. How would the Boston Jewish community answer this question? What do we essentially need to be a place of thriving? And I'm also curious for it to be answered on the local level. What's the version of this exercise that a Temple Emmanuel says to itself? What do we need in order to be a place of Jewish thriving? And maybe one of the ways that this helps us in a moment of precarity or vulnerability is it's an exercise that helps us answer, what are the things we have to do that if we didn't provide for our people, they never would be able to find elsewhere? And what are the things we don't have to do? Maybe because those needs are taken care of, maybe because people can be dependent in new ways on others. I'm thinking about this, especially with respect to something like the whole national local thing. So one of the things that many people have noticed is that during the pandemic, Jews found new shuls, right? So I think a friend of mine who lives in a neighborhood, if she doesn't like the shul that she's kind of forced to go to, was like able to, you know, connect to a shul 2,000 miles away because for the first time they could stream their services. Now this is going to create a lot of anxiety, right? Locally. Wait, how are we going to compete with the show that they're putting on over there? And maybe or another version of this is a positive version, using the Temple Emmanuel example. You all have had 20 Hartman classes throughout this pandemic, but before that, over the summer of 2020, we opened up our learning nationally to anyone who wanted to participate, and thousands of people participated. It would have been very, very hard for any local shul to construct an adult education program, even when your people really needed it, in the middle of a pandemic that could parallel what was being offered by Hartman, by Hadar, by Pardes, by other institutions. So why compete? Isn't it an interesting essentialism exercise to say, what do we need to give to our local shul people? And how do we curate resources that might be available to them elsewhere without having to try to replicate them? How might an essentialism exercise help us to not get so nervous about what we are and are not providing to our people, and instead focus on the things that are most essential to who we need to be as an institution and to what people depend upon for this institution? I know I'm opening up a lot of doors here. I'll go for another few minutes, and then I'm eager for your responses. The third idea I want to give to you is that communities manage their needs collectively. In other words, it's those who are in the community who take care of others in the community. It's not a radical idea, but there is no them, there is only we. One of my favorite rabbinic texts is a post-crisis text from Song of Songs Rabbah, which describes how did the rabbis constitute community in the wake of the destruction. And sometimes the way these stories are told are very elitist. The Yavna story is a famously elitist story. Some rabbis escape the burning embers of Jerusalem and constitute a community by themselves. And it's as much about exclusion as it is about ultimately inclusion. But there's a different version of the story, which is told about Usha, the town in the Galilee. And it says, at the end of the persecution, our teachers gathered in Usha, lists a bunch of rabbis. They sent around to the Galilee saying, whoever has learned, let them come and teach. Whoever has not learned, let them come and learn. In other words, wherever you are or however you are, come as you are. And this beautiful ending line, Nitkansu v'lamdu v'asu kol tzarchehem. They all gathered and they all learned and they took care of their needs. One of the most radical ideas that the rabbis are suggesting about community in the wake of crisis is whoever wants to be a part of it, join in, and we'll take care of each other. There's something elegant about this, something beautiful. I don't know your community, I know mine. I watched the way people took care of each other. It was extraordinary. They weren't waiting for somebody else to do it. Community is as community does. You construct community on the basis of who's there, and people take care of each other. And the Rambam's version of this, his negative image of this, is that what defines a person not being part of the Jewish people is a person who just decides not to be part of the community. Rambam says a person who separates from the congregation of Israel, whether or not they commit sins, I don't care what you do in the privacy of your own home, genuinely. But if you can't be with the people during fast days and feast days, you can't be part of the people. It's the whole question of boundaries in the Jewish community is simply a matter of whether you opt in or not. Community is as community does. The corollary to this, which is the fourth idea, is just a very simple idea that Maimonides suggests about what are the most important things that communities have to do to take care of people. And it is that communities are people and that their main responsibility is to take care of people. There's a rabbinic positive precept, Maimonides says, on the third page of the sources, to visit the sick, comfort the mourners, escort the dead, dower the bride, accompanying the departing guests. And how do I know that this is important? Because it says you shall love your neighbor as yourself. That's not an abstract question of love. Just take care of people the way that you also need to be taken care of. And Maimonides goes on to say, escorting a stranger is greater than any other reward. He goes in the fourth, the duty of visiting the sick applies to everybody. Even an eminent person visits one who is of minor importance, right? Whoever does not visit the sick is almost guilty of bloodshed. Maimonides says, comforting mourners even more so, takes precedence over visiting the sick. Because you know why? When you comfort the mourners, you're extending a chesed not only to those who are alive, but also those who are dead, and it can never be repaid. When a person is faced with either tending to a corpse or a bride, he should leave the bride and occupy himself with the corpse. And then the most amazing line in the whole thing in verse number 10, if there is one corpse in the city, all the inhabitants of the city are forbidden to perform work until that person is buried. You cannot do anything. Now, the reason I'm so fixated on this is that there's something, you talk about an essentialist exercise. There's something so basic that Maimonides is saying as what are the core activities of community. Streaming services, great, very important. But what it ultimately comes down to is communities are made up of people who are responsible to take care of each other. And it's not just an extension of self-interest. I want to be comforted when I am suffering, and therefore I should. It's not like a utilitarian exchange. I think Maimonides is trying to suggest ultimately this is what we are. We are a community, and a community is defined by people who have fundamental human needs. I have been very taken with my own local rabbi here in Riverdale, who, like you all, outsourced a lot of the adult education. You know what? My people can find all of that online. I'm going to help them find it. I'm going to make some choices. And he has spent his entire time in this pandemic visiting the sick, burying an unbelievable amount of dead, comforting the mourners, and taking care of people. And the consequence is greater enlistment by a community. Not because their rabbi is acting or seems as though he is a greater celebrity rabbi on the national stage. It's irrelevant. It's, did we constitute a community to essentially take care of our needs? I'm going to skip the last one. We'll have time later. We'll do it. Let me make a couple of last comments. Talked about community as boundaried and rooted in obligation, community as based in an essential and non-essential exercise, that we are ultimately about responsible for managing our own needs, and that communities are made up of people with basic needs. I don't think the pandemic has altered us so significantly anthropologically or even religiously in the span of 1 year, such that our fundamental human, anthropological, religious, or communal needs have shifted all that much. But in many cases, they've actually brought into relief those basic needs that have been there all along. I don't think the work of rabbis and synagogues actually has been dramatically changed that much by this time. I think we actually got quite a bit of clarification about why synagogues are essential, why the work of rabbis remains indefinitely essential, and that if anything has changed, it has been a recognition of maybe some different forms, maybe from some different expressions, maybe a little bit of clarity about what will be different without the radical shift, and maybe three practical pieces to that. One I alluded to before is this local national thing. What do you need from your local shul? What do you need from your local rabbi? And what do you not need from your local shul and your local rabbi? How could we take better advantage of relationships between what a national Jewish organization, I'll give you like an example, like a Hartman Institute, can provide at a local level, not to replace the work of the synagogue, but to actually complement the work of the synagogue? And what can a national organization like a Hartman Institute never come close to doing in terms of the local work of holding together intimate community among fellow stakeholders? This is not going to be a situation where, because a number of national organizations or big synagogues grew in prominence, they're going to put local synagogues out of business. They could put on a good show, but they're not going to hold your hand when you're sick. And how do we tease out that dichotomy is a critical post-pandemic activity to remember the essential value of both types of institutions. Second takeaway from this. This goes to the whole hybrid question, services online, services in person. I think the big change around doing streaming services online, for a lot of us, it was a lifeline during this time. For many people who never were able to make it to services, this was the first time that they were seen. It was also the first time that their experience of services was the dominant experience of services. They weren't recessive. They weren't hanging around in the background. The party is over there and you're watching it. We heard this from people throughout this year. Heard it from one rabbi in particular who told us, who attended everything we did and said, I'm disabled. There's no way I'm coming to Hartman. But you guys came to me. Now, and you know what? She didn't say this, but I heard it. She said, now you see me. And I think that's right. So something here about remembering who is the we. We've been given an opportunity to see the we of our collective more than ever before. and to reach them in ways more than ever before. So we will go back to shul. Many of us need to go back to shul. I didn't go to any shul on Zoom. I got to go back to shul because for me, a lot of it is walking there, right? That's the main thing, walking to shul. But now I have a different sense of who I see and who I don't see when I'm able to take advantage of that experience. And the last big takeaway, and this goes to a couple of the first examples I gave, is I think we have an opportunity post-pandemic to ask more of one another, to realize in community our dependence on each other. We have these neighbors across the street, a young couple with 2 little kids. They have a 2-year-old and a month-old baby. Now, our kids are a little bit older now, but I remember the fiery furnace time of a 2-year-old and a 1-month-old baby. You don't know which end is up. They were going away for Pesach, and they wound up like an hour before they were where they were supposed to be, got a call with a positive COVID test and had to drive back home to be alone with these 2 babies for Pesach. And it took them 24 hours to finally knock on our door and say, we don't even have matzah. So now, if you're a kind of person like us, and probably all of you who make Pesach for a lot of people, the thrill of being able to be like, take a brisket was incredible. It was like a joy. It was like a gift that they gave to us. And I was mad at them that they didn't come sooner. And it's just an example of we are dependent on each other. Pandemic illustrates that we are dependent on each other. That's what a community is. And what I hope will happen is the great countercultural shift that we in American Judaism have needed for a long time, which is, we're all individuals. We're in an individually oriented society. And yet here is the wake-up call that in order to live and thrive as people and as Jews, we need community, we need neighbors. And not just to be able to take advantage of it, but to be able to make demands of us, to build gatehouses and doors, because yes, it's spiritually rewarding to give somebody some brisket on Pesach. I'm not going to take that away, but it's also, we need it. We just basically need it. So this is what I wanted to illustrate, a couple of rabbinic ideas, but more than that, a moment for us to not merely respond to this pandemic by saying what's going to break and what's going to rupture, but what are the tools that are now maybe available to us to lean in and to build the communities that we need.
So Yehuda, first of all, just a profound thank you. I mean, a fish is in water doesn't know that they're wet because they're in water. So I don't know if you have a sense of how utterly brilliant you are, but the water that you as a fish are in are water of sparkling brilliance, and connecting the beating heart, the live, uncertain, ambivalent, ambiguous beating heart of this present moment with a millennial sacred faith tradition, and connecting them in ways that are so mutually enriching. Cannot thank you enough. It was just really, really brilliant. Amy has given me the privilege of asking the first question. So let me tell you what I take away from your lecture. There's a lot of brilliant points, but and then ask a question. The main thing that I take away from your lecture is that a community is people taking care of people, and that for a community to be healthy and robust, it's the people in that community taking care of people. That was the case before the pandemic. That's even more the case during the pandemic. Your brisket story, that's going to be the case after the pandemic. Now, here's my question. What happens when the legitimate needs of the people in a community have changed in ways that make meeting both of the needs of the people in your community, and you love them both, in a place of great creative tension, or perhaps it's even impossible? And what I'm losing sleep on is the word screen, S-C-R-E-E-N, and how the pandemic has changed our relationship to screen. Before the pandemic, screen on Shabbos is treif. I mean, we spent months coming up with big signs and placards for the people who used to come into our building saying, don't bring your screen into the sanctuary. Don't bring your cell phone into the sanctuary. And we want to be warm and welcoming. And we know that, basically 100% of the people who walk into our building on a Shabbos morning have screens. Please leave your screens out. Please don't turn on your screens, right? Screens are treif. And then when the pandemic happened, not only are screens not treif, screens are a lifeline. Without screens for Temple Emmanuel, there is no community, there is no Shabbos, there is no Kaddish, there is no people coming together. 7 days a week for a year and a month, screens have kept us alive. Now, and when we found, one of the surprises was, oh my God, and we're working our way through it, people love screens for services. It's much easier, more convenient. You're sipping coffee, you're at home, you're in your bathrobe. But beyond that, beyond the comfort factor, what it enabled is, grandparents in Florida to not only see their grandkids bar mitzvah, but to participate. We see you, you see us, we see you, you see us. And those grandparents from Florida, and they're there at their grandkids bar mitzvah. Now, on the day when we're on the other side of the pandemic, therefore the question is, how do we meet the needs of people, all the people, raise screens? Because there are going to be plenty of people in our community who say, we just love being able to zoom into our grandkids bar mitzvah, and we want to make that aliyah, and we want to see our kid, we want you to see us, we're there. That works. And then there are going to be other people in our community, particularly those who are actually the ones who come most often, who say, listen, screens were treif. During a sha'at dachak, a moment of urgency and emergency and crisis, it was necessary. But now that this crisis has passed, put the screens away.
Yeah.
And you can't actually meet both of those needs at the same time. So could you help us think about that?
So a couple of years ago at the Machon, thank you, Wes, for that. I lost a lot of sleep on this too. And I'll say my own personal stake is our family doesn't use screens on Shabbat. And it's especially during the pandemic, precisely because I'm here in my basement teaching all the time, all over the country, and I needed to turn it off. In fact, early on in the pandemic, when my kids were Zooming from school, and our shul said, "Hey, we really want you guys to be there Friday night because we're going to do this stuff on Zoom," and my kids just looked at us and they were like, "Nope, we are turning off." We are turning off our screens because we can't, it's not going to aid us, it's not going to help us. And we're attentive to that. That said, a couple of years ago at the Machon, Micha Goodman and I had our annual dialogue together. And we had a conversation openly about technology. And Micha has argued for a few years, and I think he's right, that technology, but in particular social media technology, has had a morally corroding influence on all of us. He quotes from Sherry Turkle from MIT, he quotes from Marshall McLuhan, talks about the empathy gap that's created on social media, the access to so much, the narcissism that's associated with all of these technologies. My argument back to him was, religious traditions are always going to be on the defensive about technological innovation. They're always going to resist it, and they're always going to lose. It's just going to be a matter of time until you concede that technology is how the world operates. And by then it's too late for religion. It's catching up to a trend that people have already adapted, and especially for 21st century humans where religion is already on the defensive, right? To resist this, resistance is futile. And I always had the sense when I made that argument to Micha that he was probably morally right, even if I think it was politically wrong. And I even asked him early in the pandemic, I said, Micha, if we didn't have technology right now, if we didn't have Zoom, if we didn't have social media, how would we survive right now? And he basically said, you're right. So Wes, what I hear in this is a little bit of like this fear that as much as these technologies saved us, they are bad. This is bad. We don't want to do this. We want to hug one another at Kiddush. There's something very different about that than the streaming experience, even though it's a lifeline. And the knowledge that who have we seen and opened up to in ways that it wasn't just that this was a replacement, an inferior replacement to what we had before. In some ways, I want us to notice what was unbelievably special that we never thought about doing. So I'll give you an example. My wife runs a day school. They always had on Fridays at the end of the day, they would get their whole school together, Beit Rabban B'Yachad, and have like a celebration of Shabbat before everyone went home to the different classrooms. So they moved Beit Rabban B'Yachad online. And you know who started showing up? All the grandparents. all around the world. Grandparents are the best. They're not always muting themselves at the right times. They think that they can actually speak to their grandchildren who are in one of the Zoom bubbles. So this, the school has to mute them. Fine. But there's no chance going back after the pandemic that they're going to move Beit Rabban B'Yachad back into the classroom. Why would you? You have now hundreds of grandparents who get to see their grandkids every week singing the Parsha together and singing songs together and talking about what was great. So the whole thing ultimately, Wes, is I think the pivot for me is to stop thinking about the superior and the inferior. It's not about that anymore. The ideal experience in shul, the inferior experience online, we had to compensate for not being able to do the superior experience with the inferior. And when we go back, we're striving to get back to the superior with a little bit of the inferior because it's there. I don't think that's true anymore. I think we have to start thinking about these as the experiences that we maximize here and the experiences that we maximize there. That's what I think the real hybrid consequences are going to be. What it might mean, Wes, is, it's not go back to being in shul and then stream for the people who are not in shul so that they can feel jealous that they're not in shul. Maybe what needs to be streamed in the future is its own curated experience. Maybe you're running 2 services from now on, one that's designed for the people in shul and one that's designed for the people who are not. I'm not telling you what to do. I never want to get into that business. But what that would do is it would say, how do we serve the Jewish needs of those who can be with us in person and who want to be with us in person? And how do we prioritize the Jewish needs of those who can't? And maybe there's a whole bunch of other things. Maybe Hartman speakers never have to come back physically to Emmanuel anymore, because I'm whatever. I'm just talking, Amy. Don't worry. I'm just talking. But like maybe this is great. Everybody gets to have their coffee in their house. More people can come in this way. We can all see each other. Maybe we actually lean into those things where it's not, let's get back to the ideal version of this experience, but maybe let's find ways to say this is constructing community that we never thought was possible before. Does that make sense, Wes? You can hear I'm struggling, but
yeah, it does make sense. I'll just leave, and then I'll open up the floor to the many questions that you have. But Stephanie's pre-Kabbalat Shabbat thing, where you now have hundreds of grandparents who otherwise would not have been there, that's literally what happens every Saturday. It's not only every Saturday, every day. I mean, we have people who come to say Kaddish literally from California and New York and Canada and Boston, and all the family members are together. That's our version of Stephanie's quality situation, and I don't think there's any going back to a world where that doesn't happen anymore.
Yeah.
I think screens are part of our life every morning and every evening until the end of time. But that's going to be very big because it meets the needs of all those grandparents who can now see their grandchildren and our version of that. But what that means for a community that's always been trained that screens are what we don't do on Shabbos is a piece of work that we're working on. Anyway, thank you, Yehuda. And Amy, you want to take the next question?
Yeah, I just wanted to say, if you have questions, chat to me that you have a question, and then we'll spotlight you and you can ask your question. And the first one to ask a question is Steve Bookbinder.
Boker Tov, Yehuda, so good to see you.
Good to see you too.
Wonderful lecture. You started with the notion that there's been a revolution, in your words, in identity and ideology in the Jewish world. I certainly agree. How does that fit with the notions of community if our identity and ideology as a people have been fractured over the last few decades?
So first of all, there is a difference between the loss of collectivity for the Jewish people versus the loss of collectivity on a local level. And those are playing out very differently. In other words, the bigger rupture that has happened for American Jews has been the sense of, do I belong to the Jewish people? is that a boundaried thing? So first of all, it's no longer boundaried because people can opt in voluntarily and opt out of this communal structure, right? It's not a boundaried identity anymore. But second, it is a source of tremendous, there's just so much hostility and conflict in terms of what's associated with the Jewish people, that it is for many Jews something that they don't want to be part of that conversation. Show me the I think it's the Kurtzer Rebbe. I learned this from my colleague Shaul Magid. Give me 10 Emestika Yidden, and that's all I need. Right? Give me 10 Jews, that's all I need. Don't bother me with this whole Jewish people business. Now, the irony of that distinction, though, is that it means that there is possibility for local community, perhaps more than ever before. In other words, people are not jettisoning, the fact that people are opting out of a construct of the Jewish people doesn't mean that people are jettisoning the notion of the importance of powerful local community. In fact, this is like a deep cut, but stay with me for a second. Some of the most interesting trends on the far left of the Jewish community by folks who are resisting the idea of the hegemony of Zionism, right? Don't want that story of the national collectivity of the Jewish people, are expressing that through belonging to local community. Things like anti-occupation activism, the strongest characteristics of it is it's the group of people with which I have Shabbat dinner. In other words, I'm actually seeking local community, not as the way many of us understand it, as one component of a larger notion of belonging, right? That's like the spheres of belonging approach. But because instead of belonging to this ethereal collective that seems to do things that politically I don't like, I get to have my local micro community. Now, what happens if we can take that idea and merge it with the pandemic realization that, like it or not, we belong to local communities? We are, right? There's power in our neighbors. There's power in our local shuls. A growing recognition by Americans, this is a totally different conversation, that our politics are much more local than we take credit for. It should actually matter who you elect to your city councils and to your school boards, that it's not just focusing on the president, it's actually local, that local matters. So I think the pandemic is a moment to see that. Now, I am concerned by the longer term implications of thinking about local community as a replacement for connection to the Jewish people. I don't want to lose the story of belong to the Jewish people. I think the way we do that, though, is by stitching those relationships together and not insisting on one at the cost of the other. And I do think there's a moment here to be able to say, we were awakened to the power of local community, and now how do we take that seriously? I know a shul like Emmanuel is huge. You are probably yourselves made up of a lot of local communities. You're a metaphor for the Jewish people. You're stitching together these local communities and strengthening collectively something much bigger. And I feel like there's something there, and that could be one of the positive consequences of pandemic is we recognized how much we are dependent on those with whom we are in local community.
Does anybody else have a question they want to ask or comment that they want to make? Michael Gardner.
Hi, Yehuda. Thank you so much. It's always inspiring to hear from you, and the fact that you can put together 100 people on a Sunday morning speaks to your eloquence and what you have to teach us. So thank you. This may be outside the bounds, and if so, you can just tell me and say it's not something you wanted to address at this time, and that would be fine. But there's a roiling question among those in a congregation who say, look, I don't want to hear about what they call politics. I come to the temple to hear about, be part of a community and have religious teaching, and politics has no part in it. And there are those who say, what's the point of religion if it's not about values? And what's the point of talking about values if you're not going to live your values? So therefore, you have to get involved in what can be termed politics. Some might call, politics is a loaded term. Some might call it living out your values. So there's that tension there. And I'm wondering if you've given any thought to how that tension plays itself out.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think I spoke at a manual, I want to say 3 or 4 years ago. I think it was 2017, maybe, on the distinction between the moral, the political, and the partisan, which I think still stands. We probably have a video. I'm going to put Brian on the spot to see if we can find it. On the tension between those three things, which I think was true then, is harder and harder of a distinction to hold on to today, but I think is critical. The distinction between our moral worldview is going to be by definition more encompassing. Political is going to be narrower. It's going to be the question of the strategies by which I pursue my moral world. And partisan is going to be the most limited, because it's who do I ultimately think between option A and option B are the better team to play out those political strategies. And I argued then that we make a huge category error in Jewish communal life, and I think in America, when we collapse the categories. And especially when we start thinking that all those who are partisan opponents to us are our moral enemies, because by definition, the minute that somebody is your moral enemy as opposed to your partisan opponent, you can't live in any meaningful sense of community with them. Now that's self-defeating. Why would we create a strategy that closes off the possibility of being in community with as many people as possible? And it's especially self-defeating when we know that in practice, we are better capable of doing that, of living with difference, than we think we are. That's what it means to live in a family. It's what it means to live in a Jewish community. What it means to have a Pesach Seder or a Thanksgiving dinner with your relatives. You know that you can withstand the fact that you have different political opinions than people who you love, and you're capable of loving them anyway. So I believe that that's a big aspiration for us, to try to construct the broadest possible communities of people who share our overall moral convictions, and to be really cautious about pushing out or excluding those who simply, quote unquote, simply are on the opposite side of a partisan issue. Now, but that, in order to do that, it puts pressure on all of us. It means we have to be striving that in the context of our moral spaces in our religious communities, to be really clear when we're talking about morality, and really clear when we're not, and when we're calling politics morality. We have to, once in a while, be willing to draw a line. Say, no, I'm sorry, your political commitments in this case put you outside of my moral relationship with you. I think rabbis are under enormous pressure on this. And I think that the best way to help our rabbis is by not testing them all the time, right? And not pushing them all the time on those lines, but actually encouraging them to stretch us. You know, the thing that a rabbi is most likely to hear from a congregant about a sermon which touches a political issue is either, Rabbi, that speech was outrageous because I disagree with you, or Rabbi, that speech was great because I agree with your outcome. As opposed to what it would look like for us to say, here's how you helped me think about the morality or the spiritual commitment here, whether or not I think ultimately I'm going to vote like you when it comes down to it. So I want us to push as hard as we can towards those types of communities. I think that that's, when the center of gravity for a community is going to be a shared set of moral commitments, we will build stronger, more intact, more resilient communities than when we are organizing around political causes. And I think that puts pressure on us. I hope that gets at what you were trying to ask about, Michael.
Last question, Jerry Jacobs.
Good morning. This is an absolutely wonderful discussion. And my frame of reference is from being a former JCC director. Yehuda, you said something about Jews being emotionally insecure, and no brighter words have ever been said. But in some ways, we're coming up from a communal trauma, unexpected communal trauma with PTSD. What are the three ways that we can create intimate connections as we return together quickly?
First, I don't know about three. I'll see if I can get to three. One thing which I've seen, I've seen, especially in the Hillel space, I think it's worth being attentive to. I think Tilly Shamer, who's the Hillel director at the University of Michigan, said this on the podcast that I hosted. There's a lot of pressure in Jewish communal life to look at numbers. How many people are you engaging? The shift that many Hillel directors have experienced, I suspect many rabbis have as well, is I don't really care about the numbers right now. I care about the people. I think that if we can, that shift is wildly important. I think the corollary to that is there is a rising awareness that a piece of the responsibility for anyone who works in Jewish education and engagement is mental health. We use terminology like anxiety or post-traumatic stress, post-pandemic. That's clinical terminology. And I certainly have never been trained in any of this, but I'm aware that audiences of the Hartman Institute, staff, fellows, and faculty of the Hartman Institute are suffering emotionally and psychologically, and that's a part and parcel of their experience as human beings. And that's going to be true for rabbis and Hillel directors also. I think the Hillel world, by the way, is seeing a lot of investment in Hillel directors and educators recognizing that a piece of their work is frontline responders to mental health crisis. Imagine you come out of rabbinical school, you think your job is, I'm going to come teach you Talmud. But the truth is you're actually holding people up. So I think that I would love to see that be something that we as Jewish communal institutions recognize as part of our work. And I think the third is, I did get to three. Go back to the text that Maimonides lists. What I just appreciate about it, Jerry, is the fundamental humanity of community leadership. Communities built on chesed, on loving kindness. We don't really have that. We really don't. We have communities built on shared purpose, right? Shared language of mission suggests something transcendent. It's supposed to be about something for the world, right? We have institutions built that are ruthless around what can I fundraise, what can I achieve, how can I demonstrate my results? There's no other way around that in the current economy. But what does it actually look like to be a community built around Maimonides' premise of the most important things we do is take care of one another? I think that's, if we learn that as a lesson from pandemic, that I don't know if we achieved the mission, but we took care of people. That seems to be that would be kind of an extraordinary takeaway.
Wow.
Wow.
Just gold. I mean, that's just really,
Excellent.
we're heading to Sinai. And when God gave us the Torah at Sinai, the Torah says, Vahi kol hashafar halef v'chazek ma'od. The sound of the shofar kept getting louder and louder and louder. Just everything you say is a shofar that gets louder and louder. And the last point about being a community of chesed, taking care of one another, that is just so simple and elusive and brilliant and profound. If we could take nothing else away from this time, the notion of committing to being a community of chesed where we take care of one another, that is just a shofar that gets louder and louder, not to mention everything else you mentioned. So Yehuda, thank you. I guess last point to close us out, Amy Klein, tell us how we can continue to learn not only with Yehuda, but with his many wonderful colleagues at the Hartman Institute.
Great, thank you, Wes. Yehuda, first of all, thank you. I'm not going to add to Wes's comments. It was sparkling and it was brilliant, and you left us with the most important thing, that the most important thing is our community. So honestly, truly, thank you. For everybody else, every time we meet, I say, make sure you check the Friday, midday, weekly Hartman at Home listserv. And I'm going to say it again, because that is the only way I can get information out to all of you about things that are not just Hartman, but TE Hartman. And most importantly, this week, there's learning coming up for Yom HaAtzmaut that you can register for through that Friday listserv. And Yehuda and Daniel and others are speaking this week, and you don't want to miss it. And looking forward to the summer. Unfortunately, we're not going to be back in Jerusalem until 2022, and it pains me to say that, but it's the truth. But the good news is that for 2021, there's more virtual learning available from Hartman, and we loved it last summer. And for this summer, it's going to be in two parts. First is a week, the last week in June, leading to June 28th to July 1st, that will be small Temple Emmanuel specific sessions for us in that week. Details to follow. The program is being evolved, but that first week will include learning just for us. And the second part of it is 2 weeks from July 5th to July 15th. And that will be public programming, virtual public programming like last summer, open to everybody, free, fantastic, and a full calendar, I'm sure. So look for details on that. So the last thing about that I'll say is the topic is perfect. I know that we always say it doesn't matter what the Hartman topic is, they're always good. But this year the topic is really good. And the topic is hope, love, and compassion, Torah of optimism for an uncertain future. And I can't think of a better topic than that. So watch your Friday emails, and this summer is going to be great again. And thank you for being with us Sunday mornings and all throughout this, because it's really meant a lot to see you all on the screen. So thank you for that. And we'll see you again soon.
Thank you all. Thank you. Bye.